If you move, she dies. That was the moment Duncan Hale stopped being invisible. For 8 months, nobody in Riverton had looked at him twice. Not once. He was the ghost behind the dumpster, the shadow that didn't count. But on that cold October night when a knife caught the parking lot light and a teenage girl hit the asphalt hard, something inside him, something everyone said a man like him couldn't possibly still have snapped wide open. He stood up, barefoot, bleeding, and completely alone. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this goes. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to people the world has decided don't exist anymore. Duncan Hale knew that silence the way a man knows the sound of his own heartbeat. Constant, unremarkable, and somehow proof that he was still alive when nothing else seemed to confirm it. He had been living behind Riverton High School for going on 8 months, and in all that time, not a single student had looked at him. Not a teacher, not a janitor pushing a cart past the loading dock at 6 in the morning. Nobody. He was furniture. He was pavement. He was the smell of old cardboard and rain that people registered for half a second and then immediately forgot. 23 years old and already invisible to the entire world. He hadn't always been this way. That was the part nobody ever thought about, that every person sitting on a curb or sleeping in a doorway had a before. Duncan's before included a mother named Patricia who used to hum while she cooked, and a small house in East Toledo where the radiator clanked every night at 11 like it was keeping time. His before included 2 years of community college studying auto mechanics, a girlfriend named Bree who laughed too loud at her own jokes, and a quiet, ordinary American plan to open a small shop someday. Nothing flashy, just his name on a sign and a lift in the garage and work he could be proud of. Then his mother got sick. Medical bills came. The girlfriend left, not cruelly, just honestly the way people sometimes do when the weight gets too heavy for 2 people to carry together. He lost the apartment, lost the storage unit, lost the last bag with everything in it on a Greyhound bus he'd been too exhausted to stay awake on. And somewhere in the losing, Duncan Hale lost the habit of expecting anyone to see him. By October, his routine was simple and nearly automatic. He woke before the school custodians arrived, folded his cardboard flat against the brick wall, where it stayed dry, and spent the early morning hours near the loading dock, where the cafeteria staff sometimes left things out. A bruised apple, a bread end, a styrofoam cup of something warm, if he was very, very lucky. During the day, he moved because standing still in one place too long made people nervous, and nervous people called the police, and the police meant losing the spot behind the dumpster that had taken him 6 weeks to properly claim. He walked the blocks around the school. He sat in the public library when the weather turned mean, reading anything auto manuals, old magazines, a dog-eared copy of Lonesome Dove that someone had left in the biography section by mistake. He came back in the evenings. He watched. That last part, the watching, had become something he was almost ashamed of, in the way you're ashamed of an ability you didn't ask for and can't turn off. 8 months behind a high school teaches you things about human behavior that no psychology class covers. He saw who the teachers favored and who they ignored. He saw which kids ate alone and which ones made a performance of their lunch tables. He saw the cruelty that happened in plain sight because the people with the power to stop it had decided somewhere along the way that it was easier not to see it. There was a group of 5 boys he had cataloged early on, had given them names in his head before he ever learned their real ones. He called the ringleader Blazer Boy because the kid wore a sport coat to school 3 days a week, in the way teenage boys do when they're desperate for people to understand they are a different species from everyone else. The one with the sharp, narrow face and the constant smirk he called the Fox. The heavy one who laughed at everything, even things that weren't funny, especially things that weren't funny, he called him Barrel. The quiet one who stood at the edge of whatever the others did, hands in pockets, never quite participating, but never quite stopping anything either. Duncan called him the Witness because in his experience, that was the most dangerous kind of person in any room. And the 5th one, the one with the knife, Duncan hadn't given him a name yet. Some people he'd learned you just watch and wait on. He would find out their real names soon enough. Tyler Brentwood, Jordan Casper, Luke Morrison, Evan Chase, Seth Caldwell. But that was later. On the night everything changed, they were still just 5 shapes moving through a parking lot like they owned not just the asphalt, but the dark around it. The volleyball game had ended at 7:15. Duncan knew the schedule because he knew every schedule connected to this building, the patterns of light and sound that organized his nights. The gym let out at 7:15 on Thursdays. The janitorial crew swept the east corridor at 7:45. The last teacher's car, a silver Subaru with a cracked left tail light, usually left by 8. After that, the parking lot belonged to the dark and the wind off the river and whatever was left over from the day. He was sitting with his back against the dumpster, his knees pulled to his chest against the chill, watching his own breath dissolve in the October air when he heard the gym door open. The girl came out alone. He'd seen her before, tall, broad-shouldered, the way athletes are, not delicate but strong. Her whole posture carrying the easy confidence of someone who had spent years trusting her body to do hard things. She wore a volleyball jacket, school colors, and her dark hair was still damp at the edges from practice. Her backpack was slung over one shoulder, and even at this distance, even in the half-light of the parking lot, he could see the patch on it, a Harley-Davidson Eagle, old and carefully preserved, the kind of thing someone treats like a medal rather than a decoration. She was walking the way people walk when they think they're alone, relaxed, a little inward. Earbuds in probably, or just deep in her own thoughts, replaying the practice in her head the way competitors do. Duncan watched her and felt nothing except the mild practice detachment he felt about most things he observed. She was a student. She was leaving. She was none of his business. Then the 5 boys stepped out of the shadow between 2 parked cars, and his detachment cracked straight down the middle. He didn't move yet. That matters. He wants you to know that he didn't move yet, because there is a moment in every dangerous situation where the brain is still negotiating, still running the calculations, still asking, is this actually what it looks like? Jordan Casper the Fox moved first. He stepped directly into her path, and even from 30 yards away, Duncan could read the posture. Planted feet, chin lifted, arms loose at the sides in the way that isn't relaxed at all. It's the opposite of relaxed. It's a body coiled around its own intention. Hey, Jordan's voice carried in the cold air. Where are you going? She stopped, pulled one earbud out. Her voice was level, the kind of level you learn to perform. Home. Yeah, he tilted his head. What's the hurry? I don't have a hurry. I'm just going home. Tyler Brentwood Blazer Boy, though tonight he'd swapped the jacket for a dark hoodie, drifted around to her left. Luke Morrison and Evan Chase moved to the right, and the geometry of it was unmistakable, the shape 5 people make when they are not just blocking a path, but closing a perimeter. Seth Caldwell, the witness, hung back 3 steps, hands in his pockets, eyes on the pavement. Nice patch, Tyler said, nodding at the backpack. His voice had the particular quality of someone who has never once in his life said the words nice patch as a compliment. She shifted the backpack strap on her shoulder, not pulling it away, not surrendering it, just repositioning. Thanks. Where'd you get it? It was a gift. From who? Silence. A beat. She was deciding how to answer. Duncan could see it in the way her chin tilted fractionally. She was smart enough not to answer, and also smart enough to know that not answering had its own cost in this moment. My dad, she finally said. Tyler looked at Jordan. A half smile crossed between them like a signal. Your dad. Tyler repeated it slowly, the way people repeat things when they're not really listening to the content of the sentence, but listening for the sound of it, listening to see if it gives them something to use. What's your dad got to do with anything? I didn't say he did. The patch, though, he reached out and touched it, just the tip of one finger, just the edge of the eagle's wing. She didn't pull away because she understood that pulling away was its own kind of declaration, and she was still measuring the room, still calculating. That's a Hell's Angels thing, right? That's what that is. Her jaw tightened, just barely. It's just a patch. Your dad a biker. Silence. Because if your dad's a biker, Jordan said pleasantly, stepping half a step closer, he's not exactly going to be the kind of guy who calls the cops, is he? I mean, bikers, they handle things themselves, right? Isn't that like the whole thing? Something shifted in the air. Duncan felt it before he fully understood it. The conversation had crossed a line, not the line where things get mean, but the line after that, the one where they get specific, where they reveal that they've thought about this, prepared for it, decided something in advance. His hand pressed flat against the brick wall behind him. I'm leaving, she said, firm, final. She started to move around Jordan's left side. Jordan grabbed the backpack strap. She spun and yanked back, and for 1/2 second, it looked like she might just be strong enough, just fast enough, just fierce enough to pull herself clear. And Duncan was halfway to his feet before he'd consciously decided to stand up. Then Tyler's hand came out of his hoodie pocket. The knife caught the parking lot light just for a second, just a flash of it, and the sound the girl made wasn't a scream. It was something smaller and more devastating than a scream. It was the sound of someone who has just understood that the situation they are in is not the situation they thought they were in, and the recalibration of that happens somewhere below language. She stumbled back. Jordan yanked the strap hard, and she went down to the asphalt on one knee, the backpack tearing off her shoulder. Tyler said quietly, almost conversationally, "Don't," and Duncan Hale stood up. He would not be able to explain it later. Not to the EMTs, not to the detective, not to the large, terrifying man who would sit beside his hospital bed and wait with absolute patience for every word. He would not be able to explain why he stood up, because the explanation required dismantling a wall he'd built out of 8 months of invisibility, 8 months of watching without intervening, 8 months of learning to separate himself from the drama of a world that had separated itself from him. He would only ever be able to say, "I saw her hit the ground, and something in me just stopped being okay with it." He came around the dumpster fast, and the cold asphalt was brutal under his bare feet, and he registered the pain of it distantly, the way you register background noise during a crisis present, but irrelevant. He covered the 30 yards in less time than any of them expected, a man coming out of the shadows barefoot to cover it, and when he planted himself between Kelly Mercer and Tyler Brentwood's knife, the 5 boys froze. Not because he was large. He wasn't particularly. Not because he was armed or armored or visibly dangerous in any conventional way. They froze because the unexpected ruptures, the script, and these boys, for all their practiced cruelty, had been running a script. Leave her alone. 3 words. Flat. Without performance. Tyler recovered first. Of course he did. The knife in his hand gave him back his confidence in approximately 4 seconds. He let his eyes move over Duncan, the bare feet, the worn jeans, the jacket with the torn cuff, the general appearance of a man who owned nothing and could claim nothing, and his lip curled. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter." "You sure about that? Because you're interrupting something that's not your business, and you look like—" He tilted his head, the gesture almost amused. "You look like a man with absolutely nothing to lose. You know what that means? That means you're stupid. That means you haven't thought about this." "I've thought about it." "Then think harder." He took a step forward. "Walk away. We don't want you. We don't even know who you are. Walk away, and this isn't your night." Duncan did not walk away. He turned his head slightly and looked at Kelly, who was on one knee on the asphalt. Her palms cut her breath, coming in ragged pulls, her dark eyes moving fast between the knife and this barefoot stranger who had appeared from nowhere and was apparently choosing to die on her behalf. "Get up," Duncan said to her quietly. "Get behind me and then keep going. Don't look back." "Hey," Jordan started. "She is going to get up," Duncan said, and his voice hadn't changed its register at all. Still flat, still quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. "And she is going to walk away, and you are going to let her, because whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing tonight, the knife makes it something that follows you for the rest of your life. You understand that the knife changes everything." For one long suspended moment, nothing happened. Kelly started to rise. Tyler lunged. What happened next took 11 seconds. Duncan would reconstruct it later carefully, the way a man reconstructs something terrible that his body handled before his mind could catch up. He went left, not back into Tyler, rather than away from him, because he'd learned somewhere from someone that the worst thing you can do against a blade is give it room to swing. He got his left forearm up. The knife caught it, not the blade edge, the side dragged, and the burn of it was extraordinary, white and immediate and clarifying in the way only real pain is clarifying. He grabbed Tyler's wrist with his right hand and twisted hard, and Tyler was strong, but Duncan had 8 months of desperation in his grip, and the knife hit the asphalt. Jordan came from the side, caught Duncan across the ribs with something, his elbow, his fist, it didn't matter. Duncan went down on one knee and felt the cold of the asphalt come up to meet him, and above him the parking lot lights were very bright and very indifferent. He heard Kelly's voice. Hey, hey, somebody. Luke grabbed her arm. Duncan got back up. He didn't plan it. His legs just refused to stay down. He came back up and he put himself between her and Luke and shoved hard with both hands flat on Luke's chest, and the bigger boy went back 2 steps and hit the side mirror of a parked car and flinched. Run, Duncan said. She ran. Tyler came back with the knife. Duncan caught it on his forearm again, because the forearm is better than the throat, better than the chest, better than the belly, and the arm can be survived. He went down the second time harder, and this time his shoulder hit first, and the world tilted, and he could feel warmth running down his left arm and couldn't feel his hand anymore. And that was new. That was a new thing. He heard the boys above him, sharp whispers, the particular pitch of voices recalibrating around consequence. He heard one of them say Tyler's name like a question. He heard sneakers on asphalt. He heard a car door and an engine. Then he heard running footsteps, small, fast, coming back toward him. Don't, he started. I'm calling 911, Kelly said, and she was already on her phone, already talking, her voice shaking but her hands steady in the way hands sometimes are when the rest of the body is falling apart. I need an ambulance. Riverton High School parking lot, yes, right now. There's a man, he's bleeding, I think it's please, hurry. She knelt beside him on the asphalt. Her volleyball jacket smelled like fabric softener and gym chalk. You're going to be okay, she said. Though she didn't know that, couldn't possibly know that, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way she clearly didn't intend. Duncan looked up at the October sky. His arm was on fire. His ribs were singing something sharp and unpleasant. The parking lot lights made halos in his vision that he didn't think were entirely natural. Your patch, he said. She blinked. What? Your backpack. Get it? Before... He closed his eyes. Don't let them take your dad's patch. There was a pause, then quietly, I have it. I've got it. He nodded. That was enough. That was sufficient. He could hear the sirens beginning somewhere far away, growing the sound of a world that was finally coming. And Duncan Hale, 23 years old, barefoot and bleeding on the cold asphalt of a high school parking lot in Toledo, Ohio, finally let his eyes close. Not because he gave up, because for the first time in 8 months, there was someone there to hold the space while he did. In the ambulance, between the sharp crack of a paramedic's voice and the pressure of a hand on his arm, he heard her say one more thing. She was standing outside the ambulance doors. They were loading him. She had her backpack pressed against her chest with both arms the way children hold things that matter. I don't know your name, she said. He was drifting, but not gone. Duncan, he said. It's Duncan. She didn't say anything else, but he heard the sound of her exhale, long, shaking finally aloud, and that sound followed him down into the dark the way a good thing will, the way something true carries itself into the places where the ordinary world can't follow. The ambulance doors closed. The sirens opened up full, and the night, which had been so ordinary and so cold and so exactly like every other October night in Riverton, Ohio, became something else entirely. Became the night that had changed everything. For Kelly Mercer, for Riverton High School, for the 5 boys who thought a parking lot in the dark belonged to them, and for Duncan Hale, the man nobody saw who chose in the only moment that counted to be seen. The sirens didn't stop when the ambulance did. They kept going in Kelly Mercer's head long after the doors closed, long after the vehicle disappeared around the corner of Ashland and 5th, long after the parking lot went quiet again, and she was standing alone on the asphalt with her backpack held to her chest and her palms still bleeding and absolutely nobody around to tell her what to do next. She stood there for 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Time had stopped behaving the way it was supposed to. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her father's name, Marcus. She had a specific ringtone set for him, 3 notes low and familiar, and the sound of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum, the way home does when you have been gone too long. She answered it before the second ring finished. Kelly. His voice was the same as always, quiet, measured with that particular weight that came from a man who had learned decades ago that volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be listened to. Where are you? Not a question. Never really a question with Marcus. Still at school, she said. In the parking lot. A pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Marcus Mercer processed things in silence the way other men process them out loud. You sound wrong. Something happened. Another pause. Shorter this time. Are you hurt? My hands, I felt someone push me. I fell on the asphalt. It's not, she stopped, looked at her palms. The cuts were shallow, but they were bleeding steadily in the way a shallow cuts do, inconsiderate and persistent. It's not serious. I'm okay. Someone pushed you. The temperature in his voice dropped approximately 10 degrees, and it hadn't been warm to start. There were 5 of them. She said it fast, the way you pull a bandage, get it over with before you can think about it. 5 guys from school. They were waiting for me in the parking lot, between the cars where the lights don't reach. She heard him breathe just once, the kind of breath that isn't about oxygen. Go on. They had a knife, Dad. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated the crack in it, pressed her lips together and started again. One of them had a knife, and there was a man. I don't know him. I think he lives behind the school. I've never talked to him. I don't think anyone talks to him, but he came out of nowhere, and he put himself between me and the knife, and she stopped again. They stabbed him, or he got cut. I don't know the difference. I don't know how bad it was. He was bleeding really badly from his arm, and he told me to run, and I ran, but then I came back because I couldn't just leave him there. I know. 2 words, and in them something shifted. She knew that shift, had felt it a handful of times in her life. The thing that happened when Marcus Mercer moved from stillness into motion. It wasn't loud, it was the opposite of loud. That was always the part that scared people who didn't know him and reassured people who did. You did right. Is he alive? He was when they took him. He was talking. He told me his name. What's his name? Duncan. He said Duncan. Okay. She could hear him already moving, the sound of a chair, footsteps on hardwood, a door. You stay exactly where you are. Don't get in a car with anyone you don't know. The police are coming. I already called 911. I know, mine are coming too. A pause. Oi, is there anything else you need to tell me right now? She looked at the patch on her backpack. The eagle, the detail of the wings, the careful stitching. She thought about what Jordan Casper had said, bikers handle things themselves right, and the deliberate calculation in his voice when he said it, the way he'd been measuring the patch from the beginning, using it like her father's name was a wall he'd already found a door through. They knew about you, she said. The one who started it, he brought up the patch. He said bikers don't call their own cops. She breathed. I think they picked me because of you, because they thought it meant I wouldn't report it. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had not gotten louder. It had not gotten harder. It had gotten quieter. And that was worse. That was always worse. And she had known that her whole life. Okay, he said, simply. I'm on my way. The call ended. Kelly sat down on the curb, held her backpack in her lap, and waited. The first police cruiser arrived 6 minutes later. The officer was young, mid-20s, earnest face, the slightly over-careful posture of someone who was still aware of how they looked in the uniform. His name tag said Fuller. He crouched down to her eye level without being asked, to which she appreciated. You're Kelly. You made the 911 call. Yes. And you witnessed the assault on the individual they transported. I didn't just witness it. She met his eyes directly. It happened because of me. He stepped in front of the knife because of me. Officer Fuller wrote something in his notepad. Can you tell me what happened? She told him. She told him all of it, the 5 boys, the names she knew, because she'd gone to school with 2 of them since sophomore year, the knife, the way Jordan had grabbed her backpack, strapped the way Duncan had come out from behind the dumpster and planted himself in the space between her and everything that was about to happen to her. She told it cleanly, in order, without crying, because she had made a decision on the curb that she would not cry until she got home, and she was Marcus Mercer's daughter, and when she made a decision, it stayed made. Fuller was on his second page of notes when the second car arrived. Not a cruiser, a black SUV that parked at the lot's entrance, rather than inside it, which Kelly recognized as a particular kind of statement. A woman got out. 40 maybe, with close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of face that looked like it had evaluated 1,000 situations in 1,000 parking lots and had learned to take none of them at face value. She wore a jacket and slacks and showed her badge to Fuller with the efficiency of someone who didn't enjoy the ritual but understood its necessity. Detective Sarah Raines, she said. Violent crimes. I caught the dispatch on this one. She looked at Kelly. You're the victim. I'm the witness, Kelly said. The victim is at Toledo Memorial. His name is Duncan. Rains tilted her head at that, a micro-expression, just a fraction of a second before her face settled back into professional neutral. Last name he only told me Duncan. Okay. She sat down beside Kelly on the curb, which Fuller clearly hadn't expected. Talk to me. 22 minutes after Kelly's call to her father, two motorcycles turned into the Riverton High parking lot. Not a convoy, not a statement, just two bikes ridden by two men who parked neatly near the entrance and walked toward the cluster of police vehicles with the unhurried, deliberate movement of people who had every right to be exactly where they were. Marcus Mercer was 6'2", with hands that looked like they'd been designed for a body one size larger and a face that had stopped apologizing for itself somewhere around age 30. He wore a leather vest over a dark shirt, the Hells Angels insignia on the back visible from 50 yards, and he walked like a man who had never once in his life entered a room hoping to be ignored. The man with him, short or older with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that counted exits, automatically stayed 2 steps back. Not subordinate, strategic. Fuller stiffened when he saw them coming. Rains did not. Mr. Mercer. She stood, extended her hand. Detective Sarah Rains. Marcus looked at her hand for one beat, not dismissively, just measuring, and shook it. My daughter. She's safe. She's been very helpful. Rains nodded toward Kelly, who had already stood up and was moving toward her father with the focused walk of someone navigating a parking lot full of police officers with as much dignity as possible. Marcus caught her by the shoulders, first held her at arm's length, looked at her the way parents look at children after near misses reading the body, the face, the details running his own inventory that no paramedic's report could replace. Hands, he said. She turned them palm up. He looked at the cuts without flinching, then pulled her in and held her for 5 seconds. Not the extended emotional embrace of movies. 5 seconds, firm and complete, and then he stepped back. You did right, he said again. Same words as on the phone. They hit different in person. He saved me, Dad. The man who got stabbed, he had nothing. He was barefoot. He didn't even have shoes on, and he walked out onto that asphalt and put himself between me and Tyler's knife, and I know. Marcus's jaw worked once. What hospital? Toledo Memorial, Rains said from 2 feet away. He's in surgery. Marcus looked at the detective. The detective looked back. Between them passed the particular kind of communication that happens between two people who are each trying to figure out how much of the other one is going to be a problem. Am I going to have trouble with you? Marcus asked. Rains almost smiled. That depends entirely on whether you're planning to do something I have to arrest you for. I'm planning to sit beside a man in a hospital. A pause. After I get the names of the people who put him there. I have the names, Rains said, and I'm planning to pick them up tonight. Another pause. So you can let me do my job. Marcus held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then quietly, Tyler Brentwood, Jordan Casper, Luke Morrison, Evan Chase, Seth Caldwell. Rains blinked, just once. Your daughter gave you the names. My daughter gave me 3. I had the other 2 inside of 8 minutes. He said it without pride, the way you state a fact. Those boys have been a problem at this school for 2 years. There are 8 other families in this city who could have told you their names without thinking twice. The question is, why nobody asked? Fuller shifted his weight. Rains kept her eyes on Marcus. Mr. Mercer, she said carefully, I want to be straight with you. Good, I prefer it. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do it right. But I need you to let me do it without what? Not aggressive, genuinely asking. Rains looked at him steadily. Without the kind of help that makes my case harder to prosecute. The pause that followed was the kind you could feel in your chest. Detective, Marcus said finally, the man who stepped between my daughter and a knife is lying in a hospital right now. He doesn't have a last name I can give you. He doesn't have an address or an insurance card or anyone to call. He has nothing, and he still did what he did. He stopped. I don't destroy things. I hold people accountable. There's a difference, see? I'd like to think you know that. Rains looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded a short, decisive nod, the kind that closes a door on one conversation and opens another. Get to the hospital, she said. I'll reach you when I have something. Toledo Memorial at 9:43 on a Thursday night had the particular atmosphere of a place that had given up on the idea that emergencies should be surprising. The fluorescent lights in the waiting area were the same at every hour. The chairs were the same uncomfortable plastic. The television mounted to the wall was set to a cable news channel with the sound-off captions, scrolling at the bottom of the screen with the delayed, slightly wrong quality of captions that are always a half-second behind what the world is actually saying. Marcus Mercer sat in the third chair from the door and did not watch the television. He sat the way he did most things, with complete stillness, his hands resting on his thighs, his eyes on the double doors that separated the waiting area from wherever Duncan Hale currently was. Kelly sat beside him with a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking because a nurse had pressed it into her hands and it had seemed wrong to set it down. They sat like that for 40 minutes. Then a surgeon came through the double doors in scrubs, pulling a mask down from her face, and Marcus stood before the woman had taken 3 steps. Duncan Hale, he said, the man they brought in at approximately 8, stab wound in left forearm. The surgeon looked at him with the calibrated neutrality of someone who had learned not to be rattled by large men in leather vests. Are you family? I'm the closest thing he has, Marcus said. A beat. She looked at Kelly. Kelly met her eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. He's stable, the surgeon said. The knife caught the radial artery. It missed the complete transection, which is the only reason we're having this conversation rather than a different one. He lost significant blood. He's going to need rest and antibiotics and follow-up care. She paused. He also had 3 cracked ribs that he hadn't sought treatment for, 2 of which appear to be older injuries. Marcus was quiet. He's been living rough, the surgeon continued carefully, her voice softening a fraction without losing its precision. His feet, the condition of his feet, the calluses, the cuts. He hasn't had shoes in some time. Malnutrition is a factor. His body was not in a strong position going into this, which means recovery is going to take longer and require more support than it might otherwise. She looked directly at Marcus. Is there someone who can provide that support? Yes, Marcus said. He hadn't hesitated. The surgeon looked at him for a moment, then nodded. He's asking for something. Marcus straightened. What? He's still groggy from the anesthesia, but he keeps asking the same thing. The nurse couldn't figure out what he meant. She tilted her head slightly. He keeps saying, did she get away? Over and over. Did she get away? We don't know who he's talking about. Kelly made a sound, not quite a word. She pressed her hand over her mouth, then took it down. He's talking about me, she said. Her voice was steady and completely wrecked at the same time. He wants to know if I got away. The surgeon looked at her, looked at Marcus. Do you want to tell him? Kelly was already moving toward the double doors. But the room they'd put him in was small and the bed was too short for him, and the fluorescent light above it hummed with a frequency that a healthy person wouldn't notice and a sick person would find maddening. He had a drip in his right arm and a thick wrapping of gauze from his elbow to his wrist on the left, and his feet, she saw, had been cleaned and wrapped, and that undid something in her chest that she hadn't expected. Someone had cleaned his feet. He was awake. Barely eyes at half-mast, the particular unfocused quality of someone navigating the border between anesthesia and consciousness, but awake. When she stepped into the room, he turned his head and his eyes sharpened by a fraction. You got away, he said. It wasn't a question. He was confirming it. I got away, she said. He nodded once slowly, and something in his face changed. Not dramatic, nothing cinematic, just the quiet dissolution of a held thing. The way a muscle relaxes that's been clenched for so long, the person stopped knowing it was clenched. Your hands, he said. She looked down at the bandages the paramedic had put on her palms. Cuts, nothing serious. The patch, she held up the backpack. The eagle caught the light. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. What's your name? Kelly. Kelly Mercer. He processed that. She could see him doing it the way the name moved through whatever fog the anesthesia had left. Mercer, he repeated. My dad's outside, she said. He wants to talk to you. When you're ready. No rush, he'll wait. Duncan blinked. Your dad. Marcus. Something crossed his face. Not fear, not exactly. More like the look of someone who has been told a thing they don't quite know what to do with yet. He's not, is he angry? She almost laughed. Almost. Not at you. Okay, he said. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Okay. Tell him I'll talk to him. He paused. Just give me a minute. She nodded. She moved to leave, and then his voice came again quieter. Kelly. She turned. His eyes were fully open now, and in the harsh white light of the hospital room, she could see how young he was. How unreasonably young, 23, she would learn later, only 5 years older than her for a person who had accumulated so much of the particular weathering that life does to people it's decided to be hard on. I wasn't trying to be a hero, he said. I couldn't watch it happen. I couldn't be another person who watched and didn't do anything. He stopped. I've been watching things happen for 8 months and not doing anything. And I was tired of it. She stood very still. I know, she said finally, but you should know what you did. It wasn't ordinary. People watch things happen every day and tell themselves that it wasn't their place. You didn't do that. She paused. You didn't do that. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away at the ceiling, at the humming light. Tell your dad I'll talk to him. She went out. Marcus was standing in the hallway, not pacing, just standing, the man with the gray beard still behind him, and two more men, now neither of whom had been in the parking lot, both of whom had the look of people Marcus had called and who had come without asking why. She stopped in front of her father. He said he'll talk to you, she said. He said he wasn't trying to be a hero. He said he was just tired of watching and not doing anything. Marcus looked at her. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in the vicinity of his eyes did something quiet and deep and not entirely expressible in the vocabulary of faces. He put one hand briefly on the side of her head, the same gesture he'd used when she was small and had done something that mattered. Then he walked down the hallway toward Duncan Hale's room. He went in alone. He closed the door behind him. Kelly stood in the fluorescent hallway with her paper cup of cold coffee and her bandaged hands and her backpack with the eagle on it, and she listened to the sound of the hospital, the distant PA system, the rolling of a cart somewhere, the low murmur of voices from behind a closed door. And she thought about 8 months of a man living behind a dumpster at her school, 8 months of walking past that dumpster to volleyball practice and never once looking, 8 months of everyone never once looking. She thought about that for a long time. And somewhere inside the room at the end of the hall, her father sat beside a bed and began to listen to a man that the world had decided didn't count, and the world's decision started quietly and irrevocably to be undone. The 5 boys who thought the dark in that parking lot belonged to them were home by now. Tyler Brentwood was probably asleep. Jordan Casper was probably on his phone. Luke Morrison, Evan Chase, Seth Caldwell, comfortable, warm, certain in the way people are certain when they've never once been held to account for anything. Detective Sarah Raines was signing paperwork. And somewhere across the city of Toledo, Ohio, a phone call was being made, the first of many that would rearrange the world those 5 boys thought they lived in. It hadn't started yet. Not fully. But the thing that was coming had already been set in motion, the way an avalanche is set in motion, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the terrible quiet of something that has decided it is done waiting. Marcus Mercer closed the door behind him and stood still for a moment, the way he always did when he entered a room that required him to read it before he spoke in it. Duncan Hale was watching him from the bed. Not with fear, Marcus had walked into enough rooms to know the difference between a man who was afraid and a man who was simply being careful. Duncan was being careful. His eyes were clear despite the anesthesia fog tracking Marcus the way a person tracks something large and unfamiliar that has entered their space, not panicking, just accounting for it. Marcus pulled the chair from the corner of the room and set it beside the bed and sat down. He didn't say anything immediately. He put his hands on his knees and looked at Duncan the way he'd looked at Kelly in the parking lot, reading the body, the face, the details, doing his own inventory. Duncan let him look. Finally, Marcus said, "How old are you?" 23. You from Toledo originally. East Side, born and raised. Marcus nodded slowly. My daughter said you told her you weren't trying to be a hero. Duncan shifted against the pillow. I wasn't. She also said you were barefoot. A pause. In October. Duncan said nothing. How long? Marcus said. Have you been living behind that school? The question landed differently than Duncan expected. Not why are you homeless, which was the question people asked when they wanted to assign blame before they'd finished hearing the answer. Not what happened to you, which was the question people asked when they wanted a story that would let them feel appropriately said and then move on. Just how long? As if the duration was the part that mattered. As if Marcus Mercer was calculating something. 8 months, Duncan said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. And in 8 months, you watched what went on at that school. Yeah, those 5 boys, you'd seen them before. Many times. Duncan looked at the ceiling. They had a pattern. Same targets, different days. The kid who eats lunch alone. The girl who cries in the east stairwell on Fridays. The sophomore with the hearing aid who waits for the late bus. He stopped. Nobody did anything. Teachers walked past. The principal, I saw him once a Tuesday morning, watched Tyler Brentwood back a kid against the wall and take his backpack, and the principal crossed the parking lot on the other side and got in his car and left. Something moved across Marcus's face. You saw that. I see everything. Duncan said it without bitterness, just fact. When you're invisible, people don't edit themselves. You see exactly what they are. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer it straight. Okay. When you walked out from behind that dumpster, when you saw my daughter on the ground and the knife in that kid's hand, did you think you were going to live through it? The question sat in the room. Duncan turned his head and looked at Marcus directly. No, he said, not really. Marcus held his gaze. But you walked out anyway. She was on the ground. Duncan said it simply, as if it explained everything, and as if in fact it did. For a long moment, Marcus didn't speak. He looked at his own hands, the large scarred hands of a man who had spent 40 years in the world without gloves, and something worked through his expression that he didn't try to conceal and didn't try to perform. My daughter has her mother's stubbornness, he said finally. She came back. After you told her to run, she came back. I know, I heard her on the phone. She could have kept running. Yeah. She didn't? Marcus looked up. You two might have more in common than either of you knows. A pause. I owe you a debt. Duncan shook his head immediately. You don't owe me anything. I disagree. Marcus said it with the flat certainty of a man who had not come to the hospital to negotiate the terms of his gratitude. And when I tell you I disagree, I need you to understand that I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it and then forget I said it. He let that sit for a moment. Rest tonight, we'll talk more tomorrow, but I need you to know right now, before anything else, that you are not going back to that parking lot. Duncan opened his mouth. That's not a conversation, Marcus said quietly. That's a fact. Sleep. He stood, replaced the chair in the corner with the same precision he'd removed it with. At the door, he paused his hand on the frame and turned back. Duncan, he waited until the younger man met his eyes. Those boys, when you're 30, I want every detail you remember. Every pattern, every name, every face, every time you watch something happen that should have been stopped. A beat. Can you do that? Duncan looked at him for a moment. Then yeah, I can do that. Marcus nodded once and walked out. In the hallway, he took out his phone. He didn't make a call immediately. He stood with the phone in his hand and looked at the far wall and did the specific kind of thinking that takes place in the space between what has happened and what needs to happen next. Then he made the call. It lasted 4 minutes. He spoke quietly in the economical way of someone communicating with people who don't need sentences explained. When he hung up, he looked at the man with the gray beard, whose name was Carver, who had been with Marcus for 19 years and who operated as a kind of human shorthand for whatever Marcus hadn't said yet. How many can we have here by morning? Marcus said. Carver didn't even blink. By morning, Midwest chapters 50-60 easy. If we push east and south. Push, Marcus said. Carver nodded and stepped away with his own phone. Marcus walked back down the hallway to where Kelly was still standing with the paper cup and the backpack and the expression of someone who has just lived through something that hasn't finished revealing all of what it is yet. He's resting, Marcus said. She nodded. Go home. Get your mother to look at your hands. Mom's in Cincinnati until Sunday. A pause. Then go to Aunt Rita's. Don't stay alone tonight. He cupped the back of her head briefly, the same gesture as before, the one that meant you did right without requiring the words again. I'll be here through the night. She looked at him. What are you doing? He met her eyes. What needs doing? She She knew better than to ask more. She'd grown up as Marcus Mercer's daughter, which meant she had learned early the particular wisdom of knowing which doors to open and which ones to understand were already taking care of themselves. She hugged him quick, fierce, the kind of hug that compresses a lot of unsaid things into a few seconds. And she walked out of Toledo Memorial with her backpack against her chest and the October air hitting her face like something she hadn't earned the right to complain about. Not tonight. Detective Sarah Raines knocked on Tyler Brentwood's door at 11:17 that night. She had two officers with her, a warrant that had taken her 45 minutes of phone calls to a judge she trusted to get signed, and the particular professional calm of a woman who had been doing this long enough to know that the first knock was almost always the most revealing moment, not what came after, but the specific quality of the silence that came between the knock and the door opening. The silence at the Brentwood house lasted 9 seconds. Tyler's mother opened the door in a silk robe, a woman in her mid-40s, with the carefully maintained appearance of someone for whom appearance was load-bearing. She looked at the badge, then at the officers, then at Raines, and her face went through 3 distinct expressions in under 2 seconds surprise calculation in the particular arrangement of features that Raines recognized as the expression of a person deciding how indignant to be. "It's almost midnight," the woman said. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Detective Raines, Toledo PD, Violent Crimes. I have a warrant for Tyler Brentwood. Is he home?" Tyler is 17 years old. "I'm aware the warrant covers his phone and any other electronic devices. I'd also like him to come with me voluntarily for questioning, or I can make it involuntary, either works." 3 beats of silence. Behind Mrs. Brentwood, somewhere upstairs, there was the sound of movement. A door. Footsteps. "You should call our attorney," Mrs. Brentwood said, but the steam had already gone out of it. She stepped back. Tyler appeared at the top of the stairs in sweatpants and a hoodie. Not the same hoodie as the parking lot, Raines noted. That one was probably already in a bag or a garbage can somewhere, and his face when he saw her did something interesting. It didn't go pale, it went careful, which told her that he had spent some part of the last 3 hours thinking about this moment, which meant he'd known it was coming, which meant the thing he'd done in the parking lot had not felt to him like the kind of thing a person gets away with entirely. That was useful information. "Tyler," she said, "come on down." He came down. His mother was already on the phone, the attorney presumably, and Tyler moved through the living room to the door with the focused non-expression of a teenager who had decided that the smart move was to look like he had nothing to hide. He was a good-looking kid, Raines thought. Strong jaw, clear eyes, the easy physicality of someone who had grown up with every advantage and had never learned to be uncomfortable in his own body. At the door, she let him go ahead of her, and then she paused. On the hallway console, between a decorative bowl and a framed family photo, was a sport coat. Navy expensive, the kind a teenage boy would wear 3 days a week to signal something about himself. Blazer boy, she thought, though she didn't know yet why the thought came with that specific phrasing. She walked out. The other 4 arrests happened within the same hour. Jordan Casper cried genuine tears, the sudden complete collapse of a 17-year-old boy who had spent 3 hours convincing himself nothing was going to happen and then found out all at once that something was. Luke Morrison's father answered the door in a rage that lasted approximately 4 minutes before he saw the warrant and went very quiet. Evan Chase wasn't home. He was at a friend's house across town, and the officer who picked him up reported that Evan had said when the door opened, "I knew it. I knew somebody would find out." Seth Caldwell, the witness, opened his own bedroom window when he heard the knock downstairs and sat on the roof of the porch for 6 minutes before coming back inside. His mother found him there and did not know what to say, which was the most honest response anyone in any of those households had managed all night. By 1 in the morning, all 5 were processed. Raines sat at her desk with 5 case files, a very cold cup of coffee, and the specific kind of satisfaction that came not from an arrest, but from the moment before the arrests, when she'd pulled up the school's complaint records and found what was there. Or rather, what wasn't. In 2 years, 14 separate written complaints had been filed by students or parents regarding Tyler Brentwood, Jordan Casper, and associated names. Raines counted them twice to make sure. 14. Harassment theft, physical intimidation, 1 allegation of assault. 14 complaints, 0 formal disciplinary actions on record, and the notes attached to several of the files were stamped with a code she hadn't seen before and had to ask the night duty records officer to translate. The code meant reviewed and dismissed at administrative level. Every single one. She wrote 3 things in her notebook. Then she made a call to a contact in the district attorney's office, left a message, and made a second call to a woman she knew in the school board's financial oversight committee. Then she leaned back in her chair and thought about what Marcus Mercer had said in the parking lot. Those boys have been a problem at this school for 2 years. There are 8 other families in this city who could have told you their names without thinking twice. The question is, why nobody asked? She thought about that for a long time. Dawn came cold and gray over Toledo, and it arrived at Riverton High with company. The first bikes were in the parking lot before 6:30. Not a crowd yet, just 4 of them parked in a neat line near the main entrance, their riders standing in a loose cluster near the flagpole, not speaking much, not moving much. Just present in the way that certain kinds of presence are felt before they're seen. By 7:15, there were 22. By 7:45, when the first school buses started pulling in, there were 40. They came from Columbus, from Cleveland, from Cincinnati, and Indianapolis, and Detroit, and Louisville, and Pittsburgh. Some had driven through the night. Some had gotten calls at 2 in the morning and left without eating breakfast or explaining much to anyone. They came because Marcus Mercer had made a call, and the call had said what it needed to say, in the way such calls work in organizations built on the specific currency of loyalty, not with lengthy explanation, but with the information that a man with nothing had stood for what was right and had nearly died for it, and that the people who put him in a hospital bed were still walking around as if the world was the same world it had been the night before. The world the call implied was going to need some adjusting. 250 by 8 o'clock. They filled the parking lot and lined the sidewalk in front of the school and stood in groups of 5 and 10 and 20. Along the street, a living demonstration of something the students pouring off the buses had no framework for processing. Not violence, there was no violence, not so much as a raised voice, not chaos, just numbers, just presence, just the undeniable physical fact of 250 people who had ridden through the night, because one man's story had landed in them somewhere below. Reason in the place where things become unacceptable. The principal, a man named Gerald Hofstadter, arrived at 7:53 in his silver Subaru, the same one Duncan had cataloged over 8 months of observation, and sat in the parking lot for 4 full minutes after he turned the engine off, looking through his windshield at what had assembled itself in front of his school. Raines would later obtain the phone records from that 4-minute window. He made 6 calls, 3 to school board members, 2 to a family friend who was a city attorney, 1 to the police non-emergency line, during which he reportedly said, "I need someone to tell me this isn't what it looks like." It was exactly what it looked like. He got out of his car and walked toward the entrance with the expression of a man approaching something he had spent years not looking directly at. Marcus was standing at the top of the steps. Hofstadter stopped 4 feet away. He was a thick man, 60s, with the florid face of someone who ate too well and slept too comfortably and had spent too many years in a position that told him daily that his judgment was sound. "Mister," he started. "Mercer," Marcus said, "you know who I am." Hofstadter's jaw worked. "I'm going to need you to all of these people. This is school property, and I have a responsibility." "My daughter was attacked in your parking lot last night," Marcus said. He said it quietly without fire, which was worse, by boys who have been reported to this office 14 times. In 2 years, 14 complaints. I have copies of all of them. Hofstadter's face went very still. "Now." Marcus's eyes didn't leave him. "A man, a good man, a young man who had nothing, who lived behind your dumpster for 8 months while you drove past him every morning. That man is in a hospital right now because he did what every adult in this building should have done and didn't. He stood between my daughter and a knife." A pause. "You drove past him every morning for 8 months. Did you ever see him?" The silence stretched. Hofstadter began. "Did you ever see him?" Not louder, just slower. The principal's mouth closed. From the parking lot below, 250 people watched a man in a leather vest hold a space that the rules of the building hadn't been designed for and couldn't close. Raines arrived at 8:12 in the black SUV. She parked, walked to the steps, and stood beside Marcus without greeting him. Just stood there, which was its own kind of statement. Hofstadter looked between them. Something in his face was crumbling around its own edges. "I'll need to call the board." "The board is already being called," Raines said. "By me." She held up her phone. I've also contacted the District Financial Oversight Office regarding your administrative discretionary fund, which appears to have some irregularities that are going to need explaining." She paused. "Would you like to go inside?" Hofstetter went inside. Rains followed. Marcus stayed on the steps. He turned and looked out at the parking lot at Carver, who nodded from 30 yards away, and at 248 other people who were there because a barefoot man in a hospital bed had done one right thing, and one right thing had been enough to move all of this. He reached into his jacket and took out his phone and called the hospital. Asked for Duncan Hale's room. The nurse said Mr. Hale was awake and had asked twice if anyone had called. "Tell him," Marcus said, "that we're here." A pause on the line, then, "He says he wants to know how many." Marcus looked out at the parking lot. "Tell him 250, so far." Through the phone, very faintly, he heard something from the hospital room. Not words, just the sound a person makes when they've been holding something for a very long time and someone has finally come to help them set it down. Inside the school, the students who had come off the buses were pressed against the windows watching. The teachers stood in the hallways watching. Tyler Brentwood was not there to watch. Neither were Jordan Casper, Luke Morrison, Evan Chase, or Seth Caldwell. 5 empty chairs in 5 different homerooms. 5 absences that the attendance office marked routinely automatically, the way the system had been marking things routinely and automatically for 2 years. But today, for the first time, the absence left a shape. People could see it. The shape of a thing that had been allowed to happen. And seeing it, really seeing it the way you see something when there are 250 witnesses to the act of looking, was the beginning of the end of pretending it hadn't been there all along. In a hallway off the main office, a girl named Amanda Cho, who had filed one of the 14 complaints 9 months ago and received in return a form letter and a code stamp and nothing else, stood at a window and watched the parking lot and felt something happening inside her chest that it took her a full minute to identify. It was the feeling of being believed. Not yet by a person, not yet by a name or a face or a voice speaking directly to her, but by the fact of 250 people who had driven through the night to stand in a parking lot because the silence had finally cost enough to make its price peaceable to continue paying. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass. Somewhere across the city, Duncan Hale was lying in a hospital bed with a wrapped arm and 3 cracked ribs and feet that had been cleaned for the first time in months, and the phone at his bedside was relaying a number. 250. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 8 months, the silence inside him didn't feel like disappearance. It felt like the moment before something begins. Amanda Cho was still standing at the window when the vice principal told everyone to go to homeroom. She didn't move immediately. She watched the parking lot, the rows of bikes, the men who stood without fidgeting, without performing anything, just present in the way that mountains are present. And she thought about the form letter she'd received 9 months ago. 2 paragraphs. Her complaint about Jordan Casper cornering her in the east stairwell, grabbing her wrist hard enough to leave a mark, telling her that if she told anyone, he'd make sure everyone knew things about her that weren't true and some that were. 2 paragraphs, a code stamp, and a sentence at the bottom that said this matter has been reviewed at the administrative level and determined to require no further action. No further action. She had read that sentence so many times she could see it without looking at the paper. She pulled out her phone. She found the photo she'd taken of the form letter the day she received it, the photo she'd taken because something told her to document it, even though nothing had told her what she'd eventually need the documentation for. She stared at it for a moment. Then she went to homeroom. She sat down. She opened her notebook. She wrote at the top of a blank page in handwriting that was steadier than she felt, "My name is Amanda Cho, and I want to tell someone what happened to me." She looked at it. Then she took out her phone and found the number for Toledo PD. She wasn't the only one. By 9:15 that morning, Detective Sarah Rains had received 4 calls from students at Riverton High. By 10:30, it was 9. By noon, when Rains was sitting across from Gerald Hofstetter in a conference room with a school board attorney and 2 representatives from the district office, the number had reached 14, the same number as the buried complaints, which was not a coincidence, but was instead the particular mathematics of silence, breaking. It doesn't trickle, it cascades, because every person who speaks makes it slightly more possible for the next person to speak and slightly less possible for the system to pretend it isn't hearing. Hofstetter sat at the conference table with his hands folded in front of him, and the expression of a man who had arrived at a destination he'd been traveling toward for a long time without admitting he was moving. The school board attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had the kind of face that processed situations in terms of liability rather than morality, was doing most of the talking. "My client has cooperated fully with this investigation," Voss said, "in any characterization of his conduct as deliberate. I have 14 complaints," Rain said, laying a folder on the table, "that were filed with this office, logged in this office's system, and then stamped with an administrative dismissal code that I've confirmed this morning is not a code that exists in the Toledo Unified School District's official protocol manual." She let that sit, which means someone created it for the specific purpose of closing complaints without processing them. She looked at Hofstadter directly. "I'm going to ask you once on the record with your attorney present, whose code is that?" Hofstadter looked at Voss. Voss said, "My client." "I'm asking him," Rain said, still calm, still that specific flatness that was the opposite of neutral, the flatness of someone who already had most of the answer and was offering the person across the table a choice about how the remaining piece arrived. Hofstadter's hands came apart on the table. He looked at them. He was 61 years old and had run Riverton High for 11 years, and had in those 11 years made a series of decisions that had each seemed individually defensible. A complaint from a family he knew to be litigious, easier to dismiss. A boy from a prominent family, easier to have a quiet conversation with the parents than to open a file that would require documentation and follow-up, and the kind of attention that created its own complications. And then the quiet conversation hadn't worked, and the next complaint came, and dismissing the second was easier than the first because the first had already been dismissed, and the logic of it had compounded the way bad logic does when nobody stops it until he was sitting in a conference room looking at a folder with 14 complaints in it and a detective who was not going to let him explain his way around the number. "I created the code," he said. Voss closed her eyes briefly when Rain said, 4 years ago, after the Henderson situation." He said it with the flat affect of someone who has made the calculation that the only remaining move is the one he'd been avoiding longest. The Henderson family had filed a complaint against it. Doesn't matter. What matters is the board didn't want a formal investigation that year because of the accreditation review, and I was told I was given to understand that certain complaints should be handled quietly. Given to understand by whom? He named a name. Rains wrote it down. The school board representative, a young man named Davis, who had been quiet for the entire meeting and had the look of someone realizing progressively that the room he'd walked into was not the room he'd been briefed on, leaned forward. "Who authorized..." "Oh, how you say, Miles?" "Nobody authorized anything formally," Hofstadter said, and his voice had taken on the specific exhausted quality of a secret that has been held so long it's become heavier than the truth it was hiding. That was the point. Nothing was formal. Everything was implied, communicated, understood. He looked at the table. "I understood what was expected of me. And the discretionary fund," Rain said. Voss started to speak. "The $1.2 million, Rains continued as if Voss hadn't moved her mouth, "that the Financial Oversight Office has been looking at since 6 this morning. Where did it go?" Long silence. "Some of it," Hofstadter said very quietly, "went to settlements, private settlements, with families who complained and then stopped complaining." The room was very still. "You paid families," Rain said, "to drop complaints. With school funds." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Davis stood up from the table. He wasn't fleeing. He was the school board representative. He couldn't flee, but he stood up the way people stand up when they need their body to do something, while their mind catches up to what it's just heard. He looked at Hofstadter with an expression that was trying to decide between fury and something closer to grief and hadn't landed yet on either. "Gerald," he said, "just the name. Nothing after it." Hofstadter said nothing. Rains closed her folder. "We're done for now. Mr. Hofstadter, you'll need to be available for further questioning this afternoon. I'd recommend," she looked at Voss, "that your client be very available." She stood, picked up the folder, and walked out of the conference room into the hallway where Marcus Mercer was standing with Carver, and a woman from the district attorney's office named Chen, who had driven directly from her house that morning after Rains's 2 a.m. voicemail and had arrived with coffee and a legal pad and the expression of someone who had been waiting for a case like this for a specific and personal reason she hadn't shared yet. Well, Marcus said. Rains handed him a single sheet of paper, a copy of the administrative dismissal code with Hofstadter's name attached to its creation date. Marcus looked at it, his face didn't change, but his hand holding the paper pressed it flat with a pressure that went well past what the paper required. How many kids, he said. 14 calls so far. It'll be more by end of day. Rains looked at him. The ones who were paid were tracking those families now. Some of them took the money because they needed it, because they were fighting a system with their own money and the school had more. She paused. That's not their fault. No, Marcus said, it's not. Chen looked up from her legal pad. The 5 boys from the parking lot the DA is reviewing for adult charges. With the knife, the coordination, the prior pattern we're looking at, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping. And because of how they specifically targeted Kelly based on her father's affiliation. She paused. There's a credible hate crime enhancement argument, the calculation about the Hells Angels that they'd be less likely to go to law enforcement that's targeting based on group identity. Marcus absorbed that. And the school, Hofstadter is looking at misconduct in office misuse of public funds, potentially conspiracy to suppress. The board member he named is going to have a very difficult week. Chen's voice was precise and unsparing. Riverton High is going to be closed for review. The board is meeting an emergency session this afternoon, and I fully expect it to be dissolved by end of day. Marcus looked at Rains. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but the mutual recognition of 2 people who had arrived at the same place from very different roads and found that the roads had both been necessary. What do you need from me? Marcus said. The witness testimony, Rains said. Yours, Kelly's, and Duncan's fully documented. I also want the names of any other families in the community who came to you informally about Riverton before last night. He pulled out his phone. I'll have Carver send you a list by this afternoon. There are 11 families. He looked at her steadily. 11 families who came to me because the school wasn't listening and they didn't know where else to go. Rain stared at him. 11. 11 million. She wrote it down. Duncan Hale had been awake for 3 hours when the television in his hospital room stopped showing cable news and started showing something else. One of the nurses, a woman named Gloria, who had the specific energy of someone who had seen everything and maintained her warmth anyway, had switched it to the local news at his request because the man in the next bed had mentioned that something was happening at Riverton High, and Duncan had said quietly, "Can you put on the local news," in the tone of someone who already knew what was happening, but needed to see it confirmed in the way that real things sometimes need to be confirmed. The footage was aerial, a news helicopter, Toledo's NBC affiliate, and it showed the school from above. The parking lot, the bikes, the people. Duncan watched it without speaking. His left arm was elevated on a pillow. His ribs ached with the deep, specific ache of cracked bones. Not sharp, just constant, the kind of pain that becomes background noise you learn to think around. His feet had been wrapped, and the wrapping was already the most comfortable thing that had been on his feet in 8 months. The reporter's voice was saying things about a gathering, about a community response, about an ongoing police investigation. The camera panned across the lot and caught Marcus Mercer on the school steps and held on him for a moment, just a moment, before the producer apparently decided that footage of a Hells Angels president standing on the school steps was either too much or too interesting to leave on too long. Gloria came in to check his drip and saw the television and stopped. "That's where you were," she said. "That's where I was." She looked at the screen, looked at him. Something moved through her face that she didn't hide. "Honey," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of a word that's carrying more than its own weight. "How long were you behind that dumpster?" 8 months. She was quiet for a moment. Then she adjusted the drip with the practiced efficiency of someone who processes emotion and keeps working at the same time. "You got anybody family?" "My mom passed 2 years ago. Dad was never..." He stopped. "No, not really." She nodded, not with pity, with a specific acknowledgement of a person who understands that no sometimes means I stopped looking for yes. "Well," she said, "you got 250 somebodies in that parking lot right now." He looked at the television. "Yeah," he said, "I guess I do." She patted his good arm and went out. He kept watching. At 11:40, his room door opened and Kelly came in. She was in school clothes jeans, her volleyball jacket, and her hands were freshly bandaged, and she looked like someone who had slept approximately 4 hours and considered it sufficient. She had her backpack, the eagle patch, facing out. "You're supposed to be in school," he said. "School's closed." She sat in the chair, not the corner chair, the one her father had moved to the bedside, and that had stayed there. "Well, not officially yet, but nobody's in class. The board is meeting. There are reporters outside." She looked at the television. "You saw?" "Yeah." "How are you feeling?" Like someone stabbed me in the arm and broke 3 ribs." "So accurate." He almost smiled. "Yeah, accurate." She put her backpack on her knees. "My dad called me 20 minutes ago. He said Hofstadter confessed." Duncan turned his head toward her. "He created a fake code to dismiss complaints," she said. 14 of them. He paid families to drop things. School money." She shook her head. 11 families came to my dad privately because the school wouldn't listen to them." Duncan was very still. He was thinking of 14 months of watching the kid with the hearing aid, the girl who cried in the east stairwell, the sophomore who waited for the late bus. He was putting faces to numbers. He was doing the specific terrible math of a person who has been a witness and is now being told the full scope of what they witnessed. "I saw some of those kids," he said. "I know." Her voice was quiet. "I saw things happen to them and He stopped. "I watched. For 8 months I watched. You didn't have a phone. You didn't have an address. You didn't have—" "I had a voice," he said. "I had a voice the whole time." The room was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that happens between people when something true has been said, and both of them are giving it the space it deserves. "You used it when it counted," Kelly said. "It almost wasn't enough." "Almost isn't the same as wasn't." She looked at him steadily. The directness in it was unmistakably her father's. "You're here. I'm here. Those 5 are processed. Hofstadter is confessing. The board is being dissolved. The families who got paid off are being found." A pause. "Amanda Cho called the police this morning. She's one of the 14. She said she's been carrying a photo of the dismissal letter in her phone for 9 months, waiting for the moment to use it." Duncan closed his eyes briefly. "She said, and she told this to a reporter, so I'm not sharing anything private. She said she called because she heard about you, about what you did. She said if a man with nothing could stand up, then she could pick up the phone." Kelly paused. "That's going to be on the evening news." Duncan opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. "I didn't do it for any of that," he said. "I know. That's why it matters." At 12:30, the door opened again and Marcus came in. He was still in the leather vest, still unhurried, but there was something different in him now, a resolved quality, the look of a person who has done what they came to do and is beginning to take stock of what it can and what it built. He looked at Kelly. "Go get something to eat." "I'm fine." Kelly. She went. She took her backpack and she gave Duncan one last look. Not goodbye, just a look that said, "I'll be back," in the language of someone who means it, and she left. Marcus sat down in the chair. He was quiet for a moment, which Duncan had learned by now was just Marcus thinking. "Hofstadter folded," Marcus said. "Kelly told me. The 5 boys, they're being charged as adults. Assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, hate crime enhancement." He paused. "Their families have been very quiet this morning. Yesterday, those were prominent people in the city. Today, their phones are ringing and nobody's calling to congratulate them." Duncan nodded. "Rains is good," Marcus said. "She's going to close this properly. I want you to know that. She doesn't need me to make it happen. She just needed someone to stop the machine long enough for her to do her job. Is that what the 250 people were for?" "That's what the 250 people were for." A pause. "Among other things." Duncan looked at him. "What other things?" Marcus held his gaze. When a man stands for something and nobody acknowledges it, the thing he stood for gets smaller. People forget. The story shrinks to fit the space that's given to it. His voice was even measured, the voice of someone who has thought about this rather than feeling it in the moment. 250 people in a parking lot means the story doesn't shrink. It means what you did gets the size it deserves. And Duncan was quiet for a long moment. "I want to ask you something," he said finally. "Go ahead. Why does it matter to you, past Kelly, past what I did for her? Why does it matter to you personally what happens to me?" Marcus looked at him. Something in his face opened, not wide, not dramatically, but the way a door opens when someone who has been standing on the other side decides to stop holding it closed. 26 years ago, Marcus said, I was 21 years old and I was living out of a car in Youngstown, and I had nothing. A man I barely knew gave me work. Didn't ask why I needed it. Didn't make me explain myself or prove I deserved it. Just gave me work and paid me fair and said when I tried to thank him that the only thanks he wanted was for me to do the same for someone else someday. He paused. I've been trying to pay that forward for 26 years. I don't always get the chance. He looked at Duncan. You're the chance. Duncan held his gaze and said nothing, which was the fullest possible response. Now, Marcus said, shifting in the chair with the efficiency of a man closing one topic and opening another, I need you to do something for me. What? I need you to talk to Rains, formally. Everything you saw in 8 months, the names, the incidents, the patterns, the dates, if you remember them, the faces, if you know them. All of it. He paused. You're the only witness who was there for all of it. The only one nobody thought to hide things from because nobody thought anyone was watching. Duncan breathed slowly around the ache in his ribs. 8 months of watching stored in the particular involuntary archive of a man with nowhere else to put things. The hearing aid kid's September 3rd week, east side of the building, Tucker Morrison, taking his earpiece and holding it out of reach while Luke laughed. The girl in the stairwell, her name was Priya. He'd seen it on a folder she dropped once every Friday for 6 weeks, crying on the same step, because something happened in her last class of the week that she spent the entire weekend recovering from. The sophomore at the late bus stop, named unknown regular as Clockwork on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the money taken from his jacket pocket so smoothly and so routinely that the boy had stopped putting money in his jacket pocket and had started hiding it in his shoe, which Duncan knew because he'd watched him do it one morning and had felt something so complex and so specific that he still didn't have a word for it. Yeah, Duncan said, I can do that. Marcus nodded. He stood. One more thing, he said. Yeah. When you're out of here and the doctor says 10 days, 2 weeks, depending on the arm, I have a shop, auto, 3 guys, good work, steady hours. My guy Reeves is looking for someone who knows engines. He said it with the same flatness. He said everything, which meant it wasn't casual, but it wasn't heavy either. It was a door held open. You said East Toledo Community College auto mechanics. Duncan stared at him. How do you know I said that? Kelly told me what you told her last night. Marcus picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. You don't have to decide now. You don't have to decide anything now except to rest and let your arm heal. He moved toward the door. But the offer doesn't expire. He went out. Duncan lay in the bed in the humming hospital room with the television showing aerial footage of his old parking lot and the ache of 3 cracked ribs and a wrapped arm that had stopped a knife and thought about the word offer. He turned it over in his mind. He looked at it from different angles, the way you look at something you haven't seen in so long, you need to relearn its shape. An offer, made without condition, without performance, without the requirement that he first explain or justify or make himself small enough to fit the size of the help being given. Just the offer doesn't expire. In the hallway outside, he could hear Kelly on the phone with someone, her voice clear, unhurried, giving information in the precise and organized way she'd given it in the parking lot, the same calm under pressure that had called 911 while kneeling on cold asphalt next to a bleeding man she didn't know. He could hear Gloria 2 rooms down talking to a patient in the specific warm shorthand of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know what people needed to hear and what they needed to have done for them. He could hear faintly the distant sound of motorcycles, not leaving, just present, still there. He thought about Amanda Cho, who had kept a photograph on her phone for 9 months waiting for the moment. He thought about 11 families who had gone to a biker because the people whose job it was to listen had chosen not to. He thought about a girl in an east stairwell on Fridays, and a boy who hid money in his shoe, and a principal who had driven past him every morning for 8 months and looked through him the way people look through things they've decided not to see. He thought about what Kelly had said, you used your voice when it counted. He turned that over too. The problem with a voice, he thought, was that once you used it, once you stood up in a parking lot barefoot and bleeding and said, leave her alone, you couldn't easily go back to silence. Not because the world wouldn't let you, but because you wouldn't let yourself. Because something in the act of speaking, of choosing to be seen, of stepping into the space between a knife and a person who shouldn't be on the ground. Something in that act rewired the internal architecture of a man quietly and permanently in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had been invisible for 8 months. He was not invisible anymore. And the world, it turned out, the real world, the one underneath the official world that had failed so many people for so long, the real world had been paying attention the whole time. It had just been waiting for someone to give it a reason to show up. 250 reasons, as it turned out, and counting. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Toledo School Board had been dissolved by emergency order. Gerald Hofstetter had been placed on administrative leave pending criminal charges. The district attorney had officially announced adult charges against all 5 boys, and the press conference was carried live on 3 local channels and picked up by national feeds before 5 o'clock. A state financial audit of Riverton High's discretionary accounts was ordered, which would ultimately confirm the misappropriation of $1.2 million over 7 years. And in a conference room at Toledo PD, Amanda Cho sat across from Detective Raines with her phone on the table between them, the photograph of the dismissal letter on the screen, and said, "I want to tell you everything." She was the first, she was not the last. By the end of the day, 9 students had given formal statements. By the end of the week, there would be 22. Every one of them had been there the whole time, quiet, carrying it, waiting for the mathematics of silence to finally tip far enough that speaking became more possible than not speaking. Duncan Hale had not known any of their names, but he had seen their faces. And when Raines sat down across from him 2 days later with a legal pad and a recorder and said, "Take me back to the beginning, to the first thing you saw that mattered," Duncan closed his eyes and he began. He talked for 4 hours. He didn't leave anything out. The day Duncan Hale walked out of Toledo Memorial, it was a Tuesday 11 days after the parking lot. He hadn't expected anyone to be there. That was the thing he would remember most clearly later. Not the moment itself, but the expectation going into it. 11 days in a hospital bed had given him a lot of time to think, and somewhere in the middle of those 11 days, his thinking had developed a particular defensive quality, the same quality he'd developed over 8 months behind a dumpster, the mental habit of not expecting things so that the absence of them didn't land too hard. He told himself that Marcus was a busy man, that Kelly had school to get back to, or what remained of school after everything that had happened to Riverton High, that Carver and the others had lives and chapters and responsibilities that had been put on hold long enough, that the dramatic part was over and the world would now return to its regular programming, which did not feature Duncan Hale prominently in anyone's schedule. He had his discharge papers in his good hand, his wrapped left arm in a sling, his 3 ribs still objecting to deep breaths in the same jeans and torn jacket he'd come in with washed. He noticed and folded on the chair that morning by Gloria, who had done it without mentioning it. He pushed through the front doors. Marcus was leaning against a truck. Not a motorcycle, a truck. Dark blue clean, parked directly in front of the entrance with the unhurried certainty of a vehicle whose owner does not worry about where he parks. Carver was in the passenger seat. Kelly was standing outside the truck with her backpack on both shoulders, the eagle patch facing out, and when the doors opened and she saw him, she did something he hadn't seen her do yet in 11 days of hospital visits. She broke into a full, unguarded smile, not the careful, composed expression of Marcus Mercer's daughter managing a difficult situation, not the focused, clear-eyed competence of the girl who had called 911 on cold asphalt. Just a smile, open and immediate and entirely without strategy. Duncan stopped walking for 1 second, which was all the stopping he allowed himself. "You look better," she said. "Than what?" "Than the last time I saw you vertical." She fell into step beside him as Marcus pushed off the truck and opened the back door. "How's the arm?" "Attached." "Ribs? Inconvenient." She laughed. It was a good laugh. Her mother's laugh Marcus had told Duncan once during one of the long hospital conversations that had ranged far beyond the immediate facts of the case into the territory of 2 people discovering with some surprise that they had a lot to say to each other. Marcus put his hand briefly on Duncan's good shoulder as he reached the truck. The gesture was the same as the one he'd given Kelly in the parking lot and in the hospital hallway, brief, firm, complete. It said everything it needed to without requiring a word built around it. "There's a stop before the apartment," Marcus said. Duncan looked at him. The apartment. "Reeves found a unit above at the shop, month-to-month utilities included. It's not large." He opened the driver's door, "But it has a bed and heat and a lock on the door." Duncan stood on the sidewalk outside Toledo Memorial and looked at the truck in the open door. And Marcus Mercer, who had driven to this hospital on the day after his daughter was almost killed, and had sat beside the bed of a man he'd never met, and had really listened, the way almost nobody had listened to Duncan in 2 years. "I haven't said yes to the job yet," Duncan said. "I know. I'm saying it now." Marcus nodded once, got in the truck. Duncan got in. Kelly climbed in beside him and the door closed, and the city moved past the windows, and nobody felt the need to fill the space with talking, which was its own kind of belonging. The specific comfort of people who have already said the important things and don't need to perform the lesser ones. The stop, it turned out, was the auto shop. Reeves was a short man, 50s, with grease permanently embedded in the lines of his knuckles, and the no-nonsense handshake of someone who evaluated people by what they did rather than what they said about what they did. He walked Duncan through the shop in about 8 minutes, 3 lifts, good tools, a parts account with 2 suppliers, a roster of regular customers going back 12 years. He explained the job with the same efficiency. He did not explain why the job existed or reference anything that had happened in the last 11 days. It was a broad term. Duncan could do it or he couldn't. The shop needed someone who knew engines and showed up. "You know a 5.7 Hemi," Reeves said. "Well enough. You ever done transmission work?" 2 years of school and a year of working it before. Duncan stopped. "Before. Yeah, I've done transmission work." Reeves looked at him for a moment with the evaluating flatness of a man who has hired wrong before and learned from it. Then he nodded. Monday, 7:30. He walked back into the shop. Duncan stood in the doorway and looked at the lifts and the tools and smelled the specific smell of oil and metal and work that he had not smelled from the inside of a place like this for a long time. And something in his chest did a complicated thing that he didn't try to name. Kelly appeared beside him. "Well, Monday," he said. She nodded, satisfied in the way of someone who played a role in something and is glad the something worked out but isn't going to make a production of either. The apartment was on the 2nd floor. 1 room, a kitchen along one wall, a bathroom with a shower head that ran hot on the first try, a window that looked out over the back of the shop and the alley behind it, a bed with a real frame, not a cot, not a mat, not cardboard against brick, and a blanket that was thick and plain and not borrowed from anyone. Marcus walked him up and showed him the key and left him there. Duncan stood in the middle of the room for a long time. He didn't unpack because he didn't have anything to unpack. That would be the next thing, there would be a next thing, and after that, another next thing, the small sequential architecture of a life being rebuilt one practical step at a time. But for now, he stood in the middle of a room with a lock on the door and heat coming through a vent in the floor and the key in his hand, and he did the thing that he had not allowed himself to do in 8 months because the math of it was too painful when you live behind a dumpster. He thought about the future. Concretely, what Monday would look like. What he'd need work boots first because you couldn't work a shop floor in whatever he currently had on his feet. Gloves, a change of clothes. The practical inventory of a man who has somewhere to be and something to do when he gets there. It was the most ordinary possible set of thoughts, and it cracked him open completely. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his face in his good hand and breathed through it the specific, ragged, soundless variety of crying that happens when a person has been holding something so long they've forgotten it was weight. And then the weight lifts and the body reports back on the full extent of what was being carried. He didn't let it go long, 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then he wiped his face with the back of his hand and sat straight and looked at the window and thought, okay, Monday. He was still sitting like that when his phone rang. The phone was new prepaid, bought by Marcus 2 days ago, on the grounds that a man who was going to be a witness in an ongoing criminal case needed to be reachable. Duncan had accepted it with the same complicated mixture of resistance and necessity with which he'd been accepting everything Marcus offered, aware of the debt, uncomfortable with the awareness and understanding slowly that Marcus didn't experience the word debt the same way Duncan did. That for Marcus, this was simply the paying forward of a thing he'd received 26 years ago in Youngstown, and the only thanks he wanted was the same thanks that man had wanted from him. The number on the screen was Raines. "You're out," she said when he answered. Not a question. "About an hour ago." "Good. I have something to tell you. A pause. Rains's pause had a specific quality he'd learned over 11 days of calls and meetings, the pause of a woman organizing information before she released it. The DEA confirmed this morning all 5 are being charged as adults. Tyler Brentwood, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, hate crime enhancement. The others varying degrees but all serious. Jordan Casper is looking at the same charges as Tyler based on his role. The others are slightly lesser, but none of them are walking away clean. Duncan breathed. Okay. Hofstetter has entered into a cooperation agreement with the DA. He's giving up the board member who pressured him, the mechanism of the fund everything. In exchange for cooperation, he gets a reduced charge, but he's done. License revoked, career over. Another pause. The 1.2 million. We've traced most of it. Some went to private settlements, 7 families. We're in contact with all of them. They're being offered the opportunity to file civil suits now that the confidentiality agreements are being challenged as coerced. And the families that don't have, that the ones who never complained because they didn't think anything would happen. That's why I'm calling. Her voice shifted slightly, still precise, but carrying something underneath the precision. Your testimony, the 4 hours you gave me last week, the incidents you described, dates, locations, descriptions, patterns. I've been able to corroborate 8 of them through security footage that Hofstetter's office hadn't gotten around to deleting because apparently nobody thought the guy behind the dumpster was keeping mental records. A pause. Duncan, your testimony is the spine of this case. You were the one witness nobody edited themselves for. You saw the real version. He was quiet for a moment. The weight of that moved through him slowly. What happens now, he said. Now it goes through the system the way it's supposed to, slowly, carefully with documentation. It's not going to be fast. She paused. But it's going to be complete. I'm going to make sure of that. One more pause, shorter. I don't say that to everyone. I want you to know I mean it specifically. Yeah, he said, I know. Take care of the arm, she said. I'll be in touch. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and thought about 8 families. 7 who'd taken money to go quiet when Amanda Cho, who'd kept a photograph for 9 months and waited. 22 students who had given statements. The 11 families who'd gone to Marcus because there was nowhere official left to go. All that weight carried quietly by people the system had decided were less important than its own smooth operation. He thought about visibility, about what it meant to be seen and what it cost to be unseen, and the strange sideways way that a man living behind a dumpster had become the clearest-eyed witness in the whole machinery of a cover-up precisely because nobody thought to close the curtain against him. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, Kelly came to the shop. Duncan was under a Silverado when he heard boots on the concrete and recognized them by now. The particular rhythm of someone who walked with purpose but without hurry, her father's daughter in that specific way. He rolled out from under the truck. She was in jeans and her volleyball jacket, the backpack on one shoulder, the patch catching the shop light. She had coffee, 2 cups from the place on Clement Street that Marcus had introduced him to, the one where the owner knew Marcus's order before he spoke it and had added Duncan's to the rotation after the second visit. You're working Saturdays now, she said, handing him a cup. Reeves asked. I said yes. He sat up, took the coffee. How's school? This was a complicated question, and they both knew it. Riverton High had been shuttered since the board dissolution. The students had been redistributed across 3 other schools in the district, while a state oversight committee worked through the institutional wreckage. Kelly had been placed at Eastview, which had a volleyball program, which she had immediately joined because Kelly Mercer's response to disruption was to find the thing she was good at and keep doing it. It's okay, she said. Different. The team is decent. She sat down on a stool near the workbench. Amanda Cho is at Eastview too. Duncan looked at her. We've been talking, Kelly said. She's remarkable. She carried that photograph for 9 months. 9 months of waiting for the right moment and never talking herself out of it. She paused. She said something to me last week that I keep thinking about. What? She said the reason she finally called, the reason that morning felt like the moment, it wasn't the 250 bikes, it wasn't even my dad, it was you. Kelly held his gaze. She said she heard about a man with nothing who chose to stand up anyway, and she thought if he could do it with everything against him, then I can pick up the phone. A pause. She said that's what courage actually is, not the absence of fear, not strength or stress in your resources. Just choosing to act when every reason not to is bigger than every reason to. Duncan looked at his coffee cup. The thing that moved through him was too specific to name and too important to dismiss with a gesture, so he let it sit. She's right, he said finally. I know. But I wasn't being courageous, he said. I've told you that. You've told me you weren't trying to be a hero. That's different. Kelly leaned forward on the stool. Courage isn't a feeling, it's an action. You can do a courageous thing and feel nothing but exhaustion and adrenaline. The fact that you didn't feel heroic doesn't mean you didn't act that way. Amanda knows the difference. That's why it landed the way it did. He thought about that. How's your arm? She said, shifting gears with the ease of someone who can hold a heavy conversation and still breathe inside it. PT starts Wednesday. Doc says full function probably, with time. Good. She stood. Dad wants to know if you're coming Sunday. Sunday had become a thing over the last 3 weeks' dinner at Marcus's house, the first of which had been awkward in the particular way of a barefoot stranger in a hospital bed, now sitting at a real table with real people who had decided he was one of theirs, and the second of which had been less awkward, and the third had been easy in a way Duncan hadn't experienced since his mother was alive, and he had it before. Yeah, he said, I'll be there. She smiled the same open, unguarded smile as outside the hospital, the one with no strategy in it. She picked up her backpack and she was almost at the shop door when she turned around. Duncan? He looked up. She unzipped the front pocket of the backpack and took something out. She crossed the shop floor and held it out to him. It was a patch, not the eagle that was still on her backpack, still preserved. This was different. A small embroidered patch, knew the stitching, clean and deliberate. He took it and looked at it. It was his name. Just that Duncan above a small design that he recognized after a moment as the outline of a boot print. Bear. Walking forward. My dad had it made, she said. He said in the Brotherhood, the patch is how you show who you are and where you belong. She paused. He said you earned one. Duncan held the patch in his palm and looked at it for a long time. He wasn't a Hell's Angel. He wasn't about to become one. That wasn't the point, and they all knew it. The point was the gesture beneath the object, the statement that a person who has been invisible has a name, and the name means something, and the something is you were seen, you are seen, you will continue to be seen. He closed his hand around it. Tell him thank you, he said. Tell him yourself, Sunday. She walked out. He sat alone in the shop with the patch in his fist and the hum of the fluorescent lights above him and the smell of oil and metal and work, and he thought about October, about cold asphalt and parking lot lights and a girl hitting the ground and something inside him snapping open like a window that hadn't been opened in 8 months. He thought about how small the moment had been, how ordinary in its own terrible way, one man, no shoes, no weapons, no plan, stepping between a knife and a person who should not be on the ground. How nothing about it had felt large in the doing of it. How it had felt like the only possible thing and also like the last thing and had turned out to be instead the first thing. The first thing in a chain that had unspooled across Toledo, Ohio in the days that followed through hospital rooms and conference tables and police recordings and school board emergency sessions and a girl's photograph kept on a phone for 9 months and 11 families who had been waiting for someone to ask, and 22 statements and 4x4 hours of testimony from a man that nobody had thought to hide anything from. All of it from one barefoot man who was tired of watching. Duncan Hale put the patch in the pocket of his work shirt. He picked up his coffee. He rolled back under the truck. He had work to do. And for the first time in a long time, for the first time since a radiator in East Toledo clanked every night at 11, like it was keeping time, since a woman named Patricia hummed while she cooked, since the word before had meant something other than loss, Duncan Hale was exactly where he was supposed to be. Seen, steady, home. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything. In Toledo, Ohio, the silence had cost too much for too long. It took one man with nothing, no shoes, no phone, no address to show a city what it had been looking away from. Duncan Hale didn't save a girl in a parking lot because he was brave. He saved her because he was finally irreversibly done with the cost of staying quiet. And in doing so, he reminded every person whose complaint had been dismissed, whose form letter was stamped and filed and forgotten, whose voice had been made small by people with power and no conscience. He reminded every one of them that silence is not the same as consent, and that one person choosing to speak even from the ground, even barefoot and bleeding, can be enough to move the whole world a few degrees toward what it was always supposed to be.